most press. But then there's the S, which is social factors. And these pertain to how a company manages relationships with the various stakeholders, its employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities in which it operates. So it covers aspects like labor relations and practices, human rights, diversity, and community engagement. The last part of the puzzle, the G, which is, I would argue, is probably the one that's least familiar to folks, are governance factors. So this relates to a company's leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, and shareholder rights. Strong governance ensures accountability and transparency in a company's operations. So why now? Why is this such a hot topic? You know, the answer really has to do with the stakeholders the ESG addresses. It's gaining increasing awareness due to climate change, social inequality, and the demand for accountability, corporate accountability. And you're seeing more and more investors, consumers, employees, and other stakeholders really prioritizing sustainable and ethical business practices, making ESG a critical component of modern business strategy and risk management. So that's kind of the broad landscape. I'd like to turn to Amanda first and see, you know, would you like to expand on that? What aspects of ESG would you like to delve into?
Yeah, I think taking a little bit of a broad approach. So most of us are on very different levels when it comes to where we are at in implementing our ESG programs, right? Some of us may just be starting out. Some of us may be a little bit further along. Either way, it is kind of daunting when you sit back and look and say, how am I going to go about putting an ESG program together and getting that into our organization? I think what I like to share with audiences like this is that all of us are kind of in the same boat, right? So as ESG efforts continue to grow and really pick up traction, all organizations are going to see requirements to manage their materials and their supply chains from a more environmental and socially governed lens. So e-waste is no different, or asset management is no different. And the lucky thing for us, those of us in the room that have ITAD or recycling companies, is we've spent the last 15 and 20 years being governed by regulatory bodies, listening and adhering to certification standards, quantifying our businesses, and working to develop environmental sustainability practices and social programming. So when you really kind of break it down that way, if we look at adopting a broader ESG framework, all we're really doing is kind of taking the many pieces that we've done in silos and rearranging them under kind of a new framework. And this is really helpful for companies like us to better tell our ESG story, show that impact to our customers or stakeholders, and then really start talking about tracking value chains and scope 3 emissions. The other thing I wanted to dive into a little bit, just so we're all on the same page with talking about scope emissions, is just kind of giving the basic definitions there. So we've got scope emissions that are broken down into scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions created from your owned operations, and they usually make up about 10% or less of your total emissions. Scope 2 are indirect, and they come from emissions that are generated or purchased from acquired electricity, steam, heating, or cooling that's consumed by your owned operation. Also about 10% of your total emissions. And then lastly, Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that occur in the value chain. And those could include upstream and downstream emissions, and they usually make up about 80% of a company's total emissions. So that's really important for all of us to understand when we start talking about how we're going to help our customers strive towards net neutral goals. It's really important for us to understand that our services fall into that Scope 3 emissions value chain, and that's one of the first things that we're going to have to start to quantify to be able to provide some tracking and reporting back on.
Thanks, Amanda. That's really helpful. Kevin, do you have any remarks you'd like to add?
Sure. I'll start with saying that I have smarter people than myself on the panel here when it comes to ESG and its definition, its usefulness, but I'll definitely speak to its practicality in ITAD, and for those of you who are in the audience that either run an ITAD or work in an ITAD, the practicality is that you have data that helps drive those things that Amanda just said. Your corporate end users are trusting you to manage their data security, they're trusting you to manage their environmentalism, and they're trusting you to manage as well as their asset recovery. But all that data culminates into something that needs to be delivered to that customer to help initiate their ESG strategies. So the data you have is super critical and important to that end user. So remember that. Remember that you also don't need to create your own practices and policies. There's very good people in the market that are doing ESG reporting and strategies and things like that that you can reach out and utilize, and then ultimately plug in your data into someone else's platform. Think third-party platforms. We use plenty of them. Those of you who are using data erasure platforms that aren't yours and everything else, we're very used to that. So you have a choice. You can invest in ESG strategy on your own as an ITAD and build it out, or you can ultimately use a third party, just like we would a Blanco or a EPS or one of those other third-party services. Those are definitely available in this strategy. So don't feel overwhelmed, because as I hear the definitions from Brooks and Amanda, and just wait, Shawn's incredibly intelligent in this way, I'm going, all right, do I need to be able to deliver at that level to my customer, or do I need to find a third party to help do that? So remember that there is availability out there in the market for you guys to grab just more intelligent people and help do that for your business.
So just a quick note on that. As a third party, it's a good point, and I think if you look at exactly what Amanda said in terms of 20% of the E part of this is scope 1 and 2, that whole 80 to 90% that's scope 3 are things like logistics, and the reverse logistics is what we happen to focus on, and we actually do track the emissions, and we can measure them and report them, and we would be that third party who, if you're trying to figure out the emissions and the carbon footprint of your ITAD processes, you really only have visibility into 10 to 20%. And you're going to need a partner who can inform you on what the other 80 to 90% is if your clients are going to ask for that.
That's an excellent point. Thank you, Shawn. So one of the unifying themes in all the sessions, or most of the sessions that I've attended throughout this conference, has been sort of looking ahead, not just defining the current state, but what is to come. So that gets to kind of the critical question, which is, when does this whole ESG movement and requirements go from what is to come, what's in the future, to now we have to do it? So Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that?
It was mentioned in the earlier session that we were just in that things are changing, right? They mentioned France's initiative around the 20% must be refurbished or reused into the environment to sell into government. So there's step one, right? And we know that the EU creates policy, and then the US begins to follow that policy much later, but they do. And we know that, especially when it comes around, medical and environment and things like that. So it's coming, it's here. We're here talking about it because it's already here. Our customers are asking for it, and it's that concept of saying, all right, what are we going to provide the customer with the data we have and with the strategy that they probably don't have? One thing that everybody should remember is that the companies you're supporting probably don't have an ESG budget yet, and we can help provide that for them, right? As providers to our end user customers, we can provide them assistance in this way because we're thought leaders, right? We're thought leaders in a way of even just the E. If we're just managing the E for them, that needs to be something that you guys are out being consultative with and just pushing it in front of your customer, being that resource for them. So it's here. I mean, it's already in front of us, but the laws are lagging behind to create. We know that Wall Street and political and everything else is driving this initiative, but laws are soon to follow.
So just a note on that, it's interesting that Europe is a bit ahead of us in terms of the compliance-driven reporting that's going on. And, for example, in Europe, the CSRD is a set of regulations that is demanding Scope 3 being reported next year, 2025, whereas the SEC regulations that just came out, all 700 pages of them, which I have not read, by the way, they're talking about Scope 3 being required in 2026. And so those are compliance-driven issues, I think, are what's waking up public companies and global enterprises to where if they have to report, then they're going to ask the ITADs that you have to report. I think that's what's driving it, really.
That's an excellent point and a great segue into sort of the next topic, which is reporting. So increasingly, customers are asking for reporting. There are regulatory requirements that are emerging in reporting. So how do we report? How do we prove any of this data? What What inputs do we use? What are the outputs? What are the various resources and tools that are available out there to help with reporting? Amanda?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think I'll just kind of start with, again, a high level, right? So ESG impact reporting refers to the process of disclosing a company's performance and practices in relationship to the ESG factors. You can do this in many different forms, right? So you can have standalone reports, integrated reports, ones that have financials, ones that don't. It's really about transparency, accountability, and demonstrating how your company is creating a long-term value while managing risks, and then showing the ESG factors that you've chosen that are either important to your company or important to the stakeholder group that's asking for them. When Dynamics started this journey probably 18 months ago, we took just a very basic approach, right? And we were reporting very simple metrics to our customers that were asking for them. Things like miles that our e-waste had traveled, or landfill avoidance pounds, or reuse volume over recycling volume. And all of those things then can be taken back through our customers' various data inputs and translated in a way that it makes sense for their metrics. Kind of taking it to that next level, though, you can look at utilizing frameworks and being able to adopt what those core factors are for your organization. So some ways that you want to go about that is looking at the frameworks and standards that are out there that already take data and metrics that you have and organize them within an ESG framework. And then you can put out an ESG report, or you can provide that to your customers so that they can integrate that into their frameworks. And then I would also recommend going through a materiality assessment. So we've done a materiality assessment, and that allowed us to identify the issues that were most relevant to our operations and our stakeholders. And in doing so, 15 major things fell out, and some of those things that we look at and put metrics around are data security, how we manage hazardous materials, labor and employment practices, and GHG emissions. So it's really about looking internally at your own organization and listening to your stakeholders, and then putting that together in a way that you can kind of aggregate that data and share that out.
Yeah, and I would mention that there are some calculators and tools available.
Yeah.
The EPA puts out a model called the WARM model, which helps you calculate greenhouse emissions. eStewards has an environmental benefit calculator. But that kind of segues into the role of the certification bodies. So what are the what are organizations like CIRI and eStewards ban, what are they doing in order to facilitate the gathering of this data and to sort of help standardize the reporting requirements? I think, Shawn, you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so CIRI, as you know, is the certification organization behind R2, and they've been, and eStewards also has a certification program, and at the moment, neither have a great ESG-oriented set of guidelines. So eStewards has a calculator or two. Some ERP systems have calculators that come bundled with those systems that you can rely on for certain kinds of reporting. One thing that CIRI is doing is creating a minimum ESG standards for reporting, for ITAD's reporting to their customers. And they're looking at, they've created a committee that includes the customers themselves, like giant enterprises, OEMs, and ITADs, and third parties like us. And part of the challenge there, and we're about 6 months into the process of defining minimum ESG reporting standards, is they're looking at some of the frameworks like GRI, CSRD, and SASB. Those are all ESG reporting frameworks that the customers, the enterprises, public companies are choosing to report into, or sometimes have to report into. So it's all customer driven. What the customers ask from an ITAD is going to really determine what you're being asked to report. And what CIRI is trying to do is put together sort of I guess, somewhat of a standard way of looking at this to say, look, if you meet the minimum criteria for R2, that checks a couple boxes under E. If you are if you're using GRI, that might check a couple boxes under S. And they're trying to look globally at all the frameworks and trying to not replicate anything, not reinvent the wheel, but trying to say, look, there's a lot of already good standards out there. They don't always line up. And so they're trying to at least get it to a point where if you're doing any one of these other things, that's good enough, and that'll get you most of the way there. I think the challenge with what they're going to come up with is, where's the data going to come from? Like if your ERP system doesn't have a calculator, you got to go out and get one. And how do you know that that calculator uses a methodology that meets the minimum criteria? So the challenge with this is to set not only a standard, but also some standards around how you come up with that data, because you can't just make this stuff up. I mean, you really need a methodology that is accepted by these other standards bodies and frameworks, and that's going to be the challenge. So it's probably going to be a year before SERI comes out with this standard, and it's going to be, I think, more of a recommendation than a hardcore. It's not an R2 level certification or anything else. It's
more of a guideline.
It's
than
a guideline,
than a credo.
and this is where we think you're going to need to hit to cover 80% of what your customers, the enterprises, the public companies are going to ask you for. If that makes sense.
Amanda, what can you tell us about what's going on at ISRI in this regard?
Yeah, so ISRI just rebranded too. Now they go by REMA, which is the Recycled Materials Association. But they have actually spent some time putting together what they're calling their ESG toolkit. So if you're a member of ISRI, REMA, I would very much encourage you to utilize that toolkit. And if you're not, I would encourage you to see if you can check it out to see if it makes sense for a membership for that, if you're looking at getting a kickstart, right? So those of us that have more progressed into our ESG frameworks, we kind of went alone on this, right? And what we're finding now is we are getting industry associations or standards that are coming alongside and helping us build out these tools and kind of pave that way so that not everyone's going alone and things are becoming more standardized and a little bit easier. So REMA has a great toolkit. It actually has 7 different chapters that look at different pieces of ESG framework. They also have adopted and built their toolkits around the GRI standard. And they have spreadsheets and templates and all things that you can actually use to put data in, to push out the data that we're looking for. And it's really kind of a kickstart to be able to get into some of this more organized data management. Also, I can just quickly touch on eStewards too. So similarly to what SERI's doing, eStewards has established an internal working group that's working on ESG and how ISRI or how eStewards is going to tackle that project. And they are really looking at coming at it similarly from a REMA perspective with more tools and assistance. I think SERI's doing a really nice job in kind of laying that foundation, and eStewards is hoping to come alongside with some different actual tangible tools that can be used for implementation. And they are rolling around ideas of having a new calculator put out or things like that. So I can also speak a little bit to calculators because Dynamic has spent the last 2 years developing our own carbon calculator, and what our calculator measures is potential emissions avoidance. So what we're able to do then is take the high intensity activity of mining for raw or virgin material, compare that to the low intensity activity of reuse or recycling efforts, and then translate that into a potential emissions avoidance that can go back to our customers' accounting and be put towards net neutral goals into the future. Our calculator was validated by a third party, Sustainalytics, and also is based on the UN methodology. So that's where if your company is looking at going out and maybe soliciting a third party or a vendor to help you put together something like that, really consider having that validation and like Shawn said, making sure that it fits with some type of standard or has that criteria that's backing it.
Great, thank you. So, Shawn, question for you. What are the emerging trends and technologies that are shaping the future of circular tech and ESG strategy? That sounds like you could write a book on that, but maybe you could address some of the high-level themes.
Sure. So OnePack is a platform company. Return Center is our platform that pulls data from other platforms and can push it. So we might pull from an ITAD platform or ITAD system and push it into ServiceNow, for example. some of those bigger platforms like ServiceNow are helping to drive the demand for the data that they're ultimately going to ask from an ITAD. So, for example, and if you don't know, ServiceNow is a 16, 17 now billion-dollar company that is a platform of platforms, they say, and it is probably the biggest platform where enterprises manage IT assets, and they manage software assets, and they manage all kinds of things. And so, you've got 50 to 60 million assets managed in ServiceNow. A couple years ago, when they realized there's a train coming, they created an ESG management tool to hop on the train, which was pretty skeletal at the time. But since then, they've been building and building. And for these big companies that are mostly global, who mostly have ESG reporting obligations in Europe, they're going to apply the same rigor to gathering data here that they do there. And so they want to do it one time, one way, in a standard workflow globally. That means that if somebody has ServiceNow or something like that, and they are using the ESG tool there, all those metrics in terms of the things that you mentioned, like emissions avoidance, the emissions footprint of your facility, for example, reverse logistics emissions, as well as the S part. The S part could be donated IT assets, because that has a whole other impact on a community, whether you're bridging the digital divide or you're providing assets to the disabled or other covered populations. Those metrics are reported in a platform like ServiceNow, and a big company who uses you as an ITAD is going to ask you to fill those holes. And so as it sort of goes hand in hand, in my view, as the frameworks, the ESG frameworks like GRI, SASB, CSRD, as those begin to merge and get more standardized across them, that means that the technology providers who are building platforms like ServiceNow and like Return Center are going to have to kind of adapt. And even the ERP systems that ITADs use, like Razor and Macor, we're all going to have to adapt to be able to provide the data that your customers are going to be asking for. So I'm not sure what the cause and effect is. It's sort of a symbiotic, if you ask for more, I got to build more, and if they build more, they're going to ask for more kind of thing. And I think it goes hand in hand, where as frameworks merge, companies ask for more. As regulations come up, they're going to need more, and the platforms that support those are going to have to adapt. And so the ERP systems that ITADs use have to progress. The platforms like ours that are the middleman between the ITADs and their customers have to adapt, and then the customers themselves, the enterprises are increasing the sophistication of their tools, and it's all going to keep going. It will never be simpler than it is today. It's only going to get more complicated.
That's a great, that's an uplifting thought. But it does kind of point to where the rubber meets the road, and that's the customer. So, Kevin, I'd like to get your thoughts on how ITAD companies can and are helping their customers and their channel partners with their ESG needs, because ultimately that's really where all this is heading, and the sort of the end result that I think is driving a lot of what's going on.
Yeah, thanks. And it's a good question, because you mentioned both customer segments that we probably in this audience we all service, which is you're servicing either the direct end corporate end user, or you're servicing that corporate end user through a partner relationship, whether that be a VAR partner or a software company or some lead gen source that you are using to own that relationship. And what we're seeing as a distributor in this space, what we're seeing is the partner community, that VAR community, is equally as unknown about this topic of ESG, but their corporate end user are asking for it. So, of course, where does the partner turn? The partner turns to their trusted source, and they're asking us, what can be provided? What do you have available? So, as I mentioned before, there are third-party sources to use for this. You build it yourself, but ultimately, it's the data you have in providing it to your customer. So how are you going to provide it? That's what both Amanda and Shawn have been talking about. It's complicated. You don't know what they want because they don't know what they want. It'd be really great if your corporate end user could just say, all right, I need these 7 columns filled out. That would make life really easy. We can fill out 7 columns of the data we already have and send it back to you, but the customer doesn't say that. And it's confusing, but and Shawn, I agree and disagree a little bit where I'm hopeful that the strategies utilized come with laws that we can all then follow, right? In a perfect world. I know we're 15 years out from that, but that's where if this was simplified and standardized, then it would make it easier for us and the third parties to be able to standardize their practice towards it. So
you have a dream.
I do. I'm an optimist in a way that, and I want the audience too to understand that you can monetize this. You can monetize this data you have.
Just got everybody's attention.
Yeah. Not everybody wants to pay for it, by the way, and they don't have budgets to pay for it. But it's definitely it's another opportunity for a revenue source if you build it and do it well. There is an absolute demand for it. It's out there. Customers need it. They want it. Whether or not you want to be able to provide that data or you use a third party, I think that's how we're going to provide it to the customer. We're going to provide them data. Right? All of this comes from data. We can provide it in consulting services too. We can provide it in, okay, corporate customer, you don't have a donation resource? Great, we do. Right? We all better have a donation resource that you're donating to. So we can help them kind of do that social part of it, and we can help them with some of the governance around here's what our company is doing. And again, if you're touting that you can help them with an ESG strategy and you don't have one yourself, that's a problem. You're selling vapor at that point, probably not going to go over successfully. So be very careful about what you offer the customer to make sure that you back it up when they turn around and ask you, well, what is your ESG strategy? Where is your documentation? So be prepared to have that available for them as well.
I think it's going to become a competitive advantage. If you have it, you're going to win over someone who doesn't. Like if you have those systems in place, those processes and policies in place, and an enterprise is looking at you versus someone who doesn't, you'll win. Even enough to offset some pricing and other differentiators, this will become a differentiator in the industry. And those who adapt now and get in a position to report what the customer is ultimately going to want for whatever reason, compliance or otherwise, you will have an advantage.
And that advantage will be twofold, where it is going to be based on, number one, who first has accessibility and availability to get the right data and the metrics in the hands of their customer. But as this continues to unfold, it will then be also who has programs to drive the best data outputs. And those are things that some of us can start working on right now too, right? Because as Kevin mentioned, it's really all about the data, but it'll eventually come down to what those data points are. And so focusing on things like how do you reduce your own scope emissions is going to provide reduction for your customer. You know, how can you drive more vertical integration? How can we reduce transportation lanes? How can we reuse more devices over recycling, downstream tracking, data security points, recycled content sourcing, and then we talked about some social programming like supplier diversity tracking or digital equity. So getting those programs in place so that we have data, but then also driving to have competitive and aggressive data points as part of those programs is going to be really critical for future competitive advantage in the space.
Think about who you're using, too. I see our friends from OneSource in the audience, and it makes me think that we don't all operate our own trucks and fleets and record all of our own logistics data. If you're using a third party, are you getting that data from them? Are you capturing what you need from your third parties as well? I mean, we don't do it all in this industry, right? We do it well, but we don't do it all. So who are you utilizing, and are you putting pressure on those partners to provide what you need as well for your own ESG strategy, but also for the reporting that you're ultimately going to give back to your customer? So don't forget all those resources that you have available to you in your third-party relationships.
I think you make an excellent point, too, about we've got to walk the walk, right? The old expression, you got to eat your own dog food or drink your own champagne, whatever the expression you like. But if you're going to be a trusted advisor and thought leader to your customer about these ESG practices, you have to implement them yourselves, and you have to be willing to share your own best practices with your customer and use yourself kind of as an example. So great points. Really appreciate your thoughts on these questions. I'd like to open it up to the audience. Anybody, we have about 10 minutes left, and love to get any questions or thoughts from the audience. Sure, go ahead. We have a microphone that we can. We do not have a microphone, so.
Just got to yell loud.
Okay, well, let me hand my microphone.
Thank you for a great panel. So you mentioned extended producer responsibility and some of the regulatory changes coming down the pipeline. I was wondering if you could kind of unpack, firstly, what is extended producer responsibility, especially for OEMs, and what are the regulatory changes you see coming up, and what is the timeline for them?
So extended producer responsibility programs it's a policy that's developed to have manufacturers cover the cost or the physical management of legacy electronics that are coming into the waste stream, as they are the ones that are putting new devices into that stream. So there are quite a few of us within the industry that support the recycling channels of these waste streams, where some of it can go for ITAD as well, depending on the states or provinces in Canada and things like that. With that, the US has 26 programs right now that have extended producer responsibility programs for electronics, but there is a lot of legislation right now that's moving in different spaces that do affect ESG and different programming, right? So we're seeing programming on the books for plastic EPR programming, battery EPR programming, a lot of solar programming, EV batteries specifically, EV charging. So all of that is having talks right now in state by state in the US about if it's going to be regulated, like we have our electronics programs regulated in the rest of the states. When we're talking about ESG or framework legislation and things like that, I think Shawn might be the better one to answer that question.
What's interesting, though, that ERP programs in those 26 states are really focused on electronics, and every state, or those 26, have different covered electronic devices by state. I happen to live in Maine, which was the first state to pass an EPR law back in 2004 around electronics. They also were the first one just last year to pass the same kind of EPR legislation around packaging, consumer packaging, which also applies to electronics. And if you look at the effect of that, it's already kind of got HP. Well, in the last session, HP is also leading the charge around looking at their packaging and making that either reusable or compostable or a whole other kind of set of criteria that they're trying to look for new packaging. But it also affects, just from a packaging perspective, what comes back into ITADs. Is it coming in a cardboard box? What are you doing with that box? Did someone calculate the carbon footprint of that box? I mean, I think part of that, it starts at the top, where, and HP is a great example of being design-led, not just for repairability, but for reusing the raw materials out of it, making it easier to put it back into the supply chain. Same thing with packaging. I think the OEMs are ahead of the game in the sense that they know it's coming. And the trend is more and more legislation and regulation, either at the state level here, or like the SEC did, they came out with 700 pages. That's probably going to get revised over the next few years. And that's actually in response to what Europe has already done. And Europe is way stricter. And I think that's where an OEM or a large enterprise having to conform to the European standards are going to push it in the U.S. to say, well, look, if you're an investor, if you're a global impact investor and you're looking at a global investment, you want ESG data to make sure that where that money is going, if you're claiming it's a green fund, it doesn't matter what country it's in, it's either green or it's not. And you're going to need the same level of data back about where you put your money as a shareholder. And that's where, even if it's not compliance driven from a regulatory perspective, it's going to be investor driven. And that's where the public companies and anyone with global shareholders are going to have to step up and report that same kind of level of data, I think.
Great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Everybody's really thirsty. They want to get out of here. Okay. Well, if we don't have any more questions, thank you for joining us today. And I want to thank the panelists. We're going to be around for a while, so if anybody has anything they'd like to talk about, any topics they want to discuss, we can either do it here or over a beverage of your choice. Thanks very much.
Thank you.